This is not a forum. It is a conversation in the Kennedy School community. It's not for the press. It's not for trying to answer the questions that we don't know the answers to about what has happened. It's a chance for us to talk together, to ask questions together about a series of tragic events which have disrupted all our lives. I must say I've been struck in answering my email or just looking at my email today to have had messages from Kennedy School graduates and friends of the Kennedy School from China, from Malaysia, from Mexico, from Romania, people from France, people who've sent emails saying, we've read about this in the news, we've seen the pictures, our hearts are with you. We feel, as somebody said from one of the countries, we all feel Americans now. It's not feeling American or not American, it's feeling human. To kill so many innocent people is wrong, it's evil, no matter what the larger cause. And one of the things we as a community want to do, as well as we as a country, is to keep in perspective in the days that come what these events are and how we respond to it. Sadly, there's a strong tendency in human beings to scapegoat, to create an other who takes the blame. And this is something deeply to be avoided. Unfortunately, it's happened in American history. When we've had tragedies in the past and severe threats, we have sometimes threatened our own civil liberties. It was Abraham Lincoln who suspended habeas corpus. It was under Franklin Roosevelt that the Japanese Americans were locked up in internment camps. It's extremely important that we not attribute to any group of people the evil actions of a few individuals. And that goes for us as a community here as well as for our country. So over the days that come, whether we be angry, depressed, sad, let's remember that we in this school, our community, committed both trying to understand what's happening, what's going on, putting it in a larger context, and respond in a positive way. I'm going to ask my colleagues here this afternoon to literally say just a few words to start the conversation. The main thing I want to do is to give you here as members of the community a chance to speak up. This is not the only time in the days that come in which we will have community discussions. I imagine as things clarify, we'll want to arrange some other things later in the week. But I thought it would be useful, at least in this time of complete confusion and despair and disappointment that we all feel, to at least have a chance to start a conversation which will continue in the days to come. Let me ask Jessica Stern, who is seated to my right, who is a lecturer here at the school and has dealt with issues of terrorism when she was on the National Security Council in the White House, and is an expert in this subject. If Jessica would like to say a couple of words to start.
Thank you, Joe. I think at a time like this, it's very important to remember what we value the most. And in America, what we value the most is our civil liberties and the idea of innocence until proven guilty, and the idea of not tarring a whole people based on what a small number have done. It's also very important that we remember that an act like this is a violation of the Western just war tradition, of the Islamic just war tradition, of international law, and that very few people could ever condone this. Most people strongly disapprove of this kind of act, and I'll stop there.
Graham Allison is the former dean of the Kennedy School, former Assistant Secretary of Defense. Graham?
Well, I think that both what Joe and Jessica said is I subscribe to strongly. I think this is a horrific event that staggers us all, and I think that we're right to be humbled by it. As I've been trying today to struggle towards thinking of some more positive side of this picture, I have several rather modest offerings, but nonetheless. This actually is a subject that's been studied here at the Kennedy School in great detail for some significant period of time. So it's not as if we haven't been trying to address it. Jessica has written quite a good book on the subject. There's a book that I did with some colleagues called Avoiding Nuclear Anarchy back in '93. There's a follow-on to that called America's Achilles Heel that came out of BCSIA by Rich Falkenrath, a faculty member who's now working on these issues at the National Security Council. There was a study group on catastrophic terrorism that Joe and I and Ash and Deutsch and others participated in. So sadly, this is a topic that we've been attempting to examine in terms of its dynamics. And in fact, there's a quite remarkable executive session that's ongoing now, the 4th or 5th session of which will occur in November, on domestic preparedness for terrorism. That's the topic, which includes the mayor of St. Louis and the police chief from New York City and the fire chief from Washington, D.C., on the question of when and if terrorism occurs, how shall the U.S. cope with it, and what actions could we take to prevent it. So point one is that this is not a new topic for us here. Point two, again, struggling for the positive. If this event, horrible as it is, serves as a wake-up call for Americans and for the American government about the delusion, I would say, if I put it in, maybe I feel more strongly today than I might have done yesterday, but the delusion of much of American defense and security policy over the past decade in the aftermath of the Cold War, it may actually help awake us to the reality. And the core of the delusion, I believe, and have argued for a decade, is the notion that somehow Americans can reach out and bomb other people when we choose, as if we were living on a different planet. So over the past 10 years, Americans have reached out and caused people to die in Bosnia, Serbia, Afghanistan, Sudan, Iraq, regularly, and others, as if somehow we were invulnerable, or that it would have been unfair. And I have been writing about what I call the morning after for some time, because, God forbid, it's not too hard to imagine that some people become resentful and some people even seek revenge, whoever this might have been in this case. Finally, just a last point, Joe, of trying to be positive. I would say what could come out of this that would be positive, and I would hope it would be a sane but serious commitment to an all-azimuth defense against what will be forever a serious vulnerability of American society and other societies to acts of terrorism. Now, a sane, as Jessica said, means not forgetting that the reason why we like to live in a free country is because we can be free, and that it's quite easy to imagine actions that could put us into a prison that would be more secure, but we didn't want to live in a prison. So that's sane on the one hand, but serious on the other would mean that one would be asking, what are all the ways in which people can do horrific things, and what can we do about them? And if you want a pretty good list of things to do about them, you can find a list in Avoiding Nuclear Anarchy, to take the nuclear side of the picture, or the recent Baker-Cutler Task Force, which has got an agenda for action, or in the piece on catastrophic terrorism, or in Falkenrath and Company's Achilles Heel. But it starts with intelligence. It includes preemptive action to prevent acts of terrorism, and includes serious homeland defense. Now, if you were to go to the Defense Department today, or the National Security Fellows, and say, what percentage of our current defense effort is devoted to homeland defense depends on how you count it, but out of 330 billion, I would count about 10 only if stretching, okay? So I think that this may actually serve as a sobering event, horrific as it is, to cause us to do some things that may prevent even worse events to follow, though I would think it, as I've said for a decade, I believe it is quite likely that even worse things than this will happen in our lifetimes.
Miles Shore is a lecturer at the school and a psychiatrist and knows a great deal about trauma and traumatic events. Miles?
Thank you very much, Joe. Both Jessica and Graham have talked about the longer term, mostly about the longer term effects of this, and that's very salutary. But let me focus a little bit closer to where we are now. Obviously, we're all shocked by what's happened, and there's a great deal of grief about, obviously, people we don't know who've been injured and killed, and also grief about people we do know, because every one of us, as things play out, will know people who know people or perhaps know directly. Already I've heard of some people who are here at the Kennedy School who have lost people in the plane crashes. I think there are two things that happen. People feel terrible about the grieving and the sadness of this, but there's also a feeling that we all have of vulnerability. None of us feels as safe today as we felt yesterday. And the only antidote I know to that is to think about things that we can do. I thought that the possibility, I guess now the certainty, that there will be a blood drive here tomorrow is very, very important. Some members of this community are already taking steps. You might be interested to know that the medical school has really cleared out the medical area offices and laboratories because it's expected that casualties will be evacuated from New York to Boston hospitals by military helicopters, so that we're all pitching in. We do know that, well, one person I'm acquainted with, Carl Valenziano, who's an MPA, has gone off to New Jersey because he heads one of the nation's outstanding trauma centers, several of them, in fact, and he's gone on duty. As the conversation evolves, I think it might be very interesting to hear from all of you about things that all of us in the Harvard community are actually already doing and things that we can do. Because the best way to salvage something out of this is to feel that we've been useful and have been able to do some positive things.
David Gergen is a professor here and co-director of the Center for Public Leadership, but has also served in 4 White Houses in which he's noticed some crises in the past.
Thanks. Watching those horrific scenes today here in the forum, one was inevitably reminded of another time 60 years ago when an American president went before a joint session of Congress and began by saying, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day which shall live in infamy, the United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked. We haven't seen anything like that since, not until now. And I expect many people will look upon September 11th, 2001 as another day in infamy. The question becomes how we respond, which was the question Dean Nye put to us in the beginning. The national government is going to face exactly the issue that he raised, and that is an enormous pressure, public pressure, to respond, to retaliate in ways which may stretch far beyond American traditions, to clamp down on civil liberties here at home, to perhaps isolate some among us who are from other nations, to strike out, perhaps blindly, at targets overseas. And I think the issue becomes, can there be an appropriate response, one that is balanced, that does indeed, I think, strike a measure. One cannot sit here helplessly and not do anything. You have to respond as a nation. The President of the United States has to respond. But the issue is, can you respond in a way that is appropriate, that's balanced, that's within keeping of our traditions, and respects the international community, the opinions of the international community. It means working far more. I think Graham has raised the issue of how we work with the rest of the international community, whether we're engaged far more than we have been in the past and working with other nations, and indeed at a time when we seem to have been retreating from some of our responsibilities overseas. This is, I think, a wake-up call for all of us to say that America really does have a responsibility toward the rest of the world that goes beyond what we've been expressing recently. And clearly taking steps to protect ourselves against terrorism, those steps need to be stepped up. I had the opportunity to participate in a war game in Washington and Andrews Air Force Base about 6 or 7 weeks ago regarding biological terrorism. And the clear message of that exercise was that we are far more vulnerable to biological terrorism than perhaps we could ever imagine. The other issue, though, is how do we all respond at Kennedy School beyond what goes on in the classroom? And clearly there are many professors here who, because this institution within a university context is closer to this issue, and I think we bear more responsibility for thinking about it than any other school within the university framework. How we not only do have that conversation in the classroom, how we have conversations beyond the classroom among ourselves. And I say this particularly to those of you who are arriving here at the Kennedy School as students. That so many of you come from overseas, and there's no better place, it seems to me, to have conversations about that not only help to prevent our international students from feeling isolated in some fashion now, or to feel odd or strange, but to what kind of world do you all want to fashion, and how are you going to get there? This is going to become your world. You're going to become the leaders of this world in the not very distant future. And it seems to me this is the time to really begin having that conversation in a very serious way.
Thank you. We have 2 microphones that are handheld, but it may be for some folks who we can't get a microphone to, you may just have to speak loudly, and I'll try to repeat the thoughts or questions. But I'd like to have other members of the community express their views. And please say your name and what part of the Kennedy School community you are. I might say that if there are any press present, this is not for the press. This is for the Kennedy School community. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Bill McCampbell. I'm an MP1. I had a couple reactions to this happened. I was wondering if you guys would like to answer a couple of questions. First of all, what will the United States do to make sure that when we commit reprisals against whoever it is, make sure we get the right people, kind of not do what the Mossad did in 1973 in Berlin, and get some people. The second thing is there's been rumors running around of possibly very hardcore retaliations. Some people have even said nuclear. What would we do in a situation like this? How far would we go?
The question of how would we retaliate, how far would we go, how would we make sure we don't kill innocent people, which is the ultimate evil behind this whole issue. Jessica, you are an expert on terrorism, have worked in the NSC on this. Why don't you try to take a first crack at that?
I think you're right that there probably will be among many people a desire rapidly to retaliate, and I think that would be a tragedy, and I hope that this will not happen. I think it's critically important that we not rush to judgment and that we remember that terrorists often want us to overreact, and if we overreact, we're playing into their hands. Moreover, we're assisting them in mobilizing followers if we overreact. Most people are on our side today. If we overreact, we will destroy that feeling.
Other observations or questions? Yes. Here comes a mic. It is right behind you. Yeah.
Just on that one, just a quick one. I think a nuclear response is very, very, very unlikely, fortunately.
Yes, I'd like to know.
Please say who you are in the Kennedy School community.
I'm sorry. I'm Ernest Goodson. I'm a mid-career student, and I'd like to know, I guess particularly from Mr. Gergen, since he worked in the White House, if you're the president, who do you call in, and what are you expecting to hear, and when do you make a decision?
Well, this becomes one of those moments when the people around the president matter a great deal. How much experience they have, how much wisdom, how much balance, how much solidity. In a crisis, what one finds in a place like the White House, and everyone here has been through this, is that some people fall apart. They panic, they have very irrational responses, and other people, it calls out the best in them. And you see them rise to the occasion, and they're true leaders. And I think that we're blessed in this case, if I may say so, by the fact that Colin Powell and Dick Cheney are there. They're both very balanced, thoughtful people in a crisis. I've seen both of them in those moments. The Secretary of State was in Peru when this happened. He's on his way back. The Vice President is in Washington, I believe. And the President now has a very difficult problem, because he's going to be asking for intelligence from the same community in which a huge intelligence failure has occurred. And how is he going to know how to evaluate that information when he gets it? It's going to be in scraps. Joe's been at the agency and can perhaps address this much more fully than I can. But that's going to be difficult, because he's going to be operating in a sort of gray, smoky world in which it's so often true in these crises that in the first 24 hours, about half the information that comes into the White House is wrong. But you don't know which half. And that's why I think Jessica's point about not responding too quickly until you can sort it out. But having to sort through this and then make a response which balances inevitable desire for revenge on the part of your own public with the need to not, in effect, become a terrorist country yourself against others you're going after. That becomes a real question of judgment. And judgment here, Ted Sorensen was here last year. Ted's very sick today. Ted was here last year and talking about the 13 days, and he made the point again and again. The judgment that's required in a moment of crisis is what's critical. And that's where you look to the president, that's where you look to the people around him.
I just would echo what David said, that in my experience and what I've seen in government, that it's almost always true that the first information you get is partial, it's scraps. It's not that anybody intends to mislead, but people seize on a piece of it. It gets passed from one to another, somewhat distorted, and it is extraordinarily important to be careful not to act too quickly on information which you can almost be sure will be incomplete. I had a sad personal experience of my deputy, Joe Krusel, who was a Kennedy School graduate. His picture is right over here on the wall. Having a report early one Saturday morning that there'd been an accident near Sarajevo, and his car had gone off the road, his armored personnel carrier had gone off the road, and he'd been hurt. And by the middle of the day, he'd become seriously hurt, and late in the day, I was told that he'd been killed. He actually was killed right away. You never know all the information you need right away. It's extremely important to have cool heads, as David said, in how you react. Other thoughts? Yes.
In light of what you're just saying about having cooler heads, I'm seeing above your head reports that the national airlines will be reopening tomorrow at noon, and I'm really interested in knowing what kind of immediate responses you can imagine will be taken to try and ensure that at least in the immediate future there's not additional threats to other sites or the same sites. I can't begin to anticipate how we go about doing that. I'm just wondering what you might have to add.
Graham, do you want to take a try?
Well, this is, I've been on the phone with various people today trying to help analyze that question, and I think the answer is who knows, okay? But I'll at least give you a couple of thoughts. First, you worry about such events that they become, that they encourage a copycat phenomenon. There were no airline hijackings for a long time, and then there were a lot of airline hijackings. Now, then there came to be a system for trying to prevent them, and that system has gotten flabbier and flabbier, as this suggests. This was a sufficiently sophisticated and coordinated effort that I think, if I were betting it, it's less likely that somebody jumps onto an airplane tomorrow and says, I've got a great idea, let's commit suicide by hitting the Chicago tower, but they could do, because it gives people, of whom there's quite a large number of nutty people in America, just by itself, and then others as well, bad ideas. So that's one thing. Secondly, this is a sufficiently sophisticated attack that I would not rule out at all your hypothesis that folks have something else in mind. I would suspect it's from a different part of the portfolio. And if you just look at the studies that have been done of this topic, America is vulnerable in a dozen ways from Sunday. So I don't want to produce a list here today, but you can go actually look at one of the books and find a good list of alternative ways that other bad things could happen.
Yes.
My name is Dr. DeVille, and I'm a big career MPA student. First, thanks for holding this.
Where's the mic?
You want
Is the mic nearby? Or
Send it up, please.
here? Come stand here.
No, here it is, Joe.
Thank you. My name is Duncan DeVille. I'm a MPA student. Thank you, Dean Nye, for holding this session. It seems there are one of two ways to respond, and they're not mutually exclusive. One can be a military response, one can be a response through the criminal justice system. In recent years, we've seen the latter used in terrorist cases, and there's been some talk that maybe that's not effective. And I'm wondering what the panel members think as to a criminal justice response to treat this as a domestic case where the FBI goes in and gathers evidence, where we spread money around and we get informants, or to treat it as a military, a case in which there's military reprisal.
Jessica?
I feel very strongly that using the court system is very important, if nothing else, because it sends out the message that there is nothing romantic about this kind of attack. It is a crime. It's not glamorous. On the other hand, depending on what we learn in the next few days and weeks, it's a combination of, if it is an international incident, a combination of diplomatic, intelligence, possibly military response could be warranted. I believe that all of these are important tools. Using the courts to go after terrorists is really one of the most important tools, I believe.
Other comment? Yes. There's a mic there.
Rodrigo Martinez, MPID alumni. The question, Dina, is stepping back a little bit from the tragedy and this terrible event. Sometimes we use conceptual and theoretical tools, and we've been reading these for years. How does this start changing how we think of international relations, the non-state actors, these tools that we've used that increasingly are not so much according to reality anymore, but were based on an old model, we could apply them in the Cold War, and now increasingly we don't have the material that we used to have for the reality of the moment. So from this conceptual theoretical perspective, what is different in what is coming in this sense?
Well, it's ironic that you would ask me this, because on my desk, to return to the Oxford Press today, is the copy-edited version of the book that I wrote when I took a leave of absence last spring. And there's a whole chapter that says, if you think of the world as billiard ball states balancing each other's power, you're missing something, which is that there are agents which cut across states, which can do much more damage, and there's no way to make yourself invulnerable to that. The only way you can deal with it is by working with others, not against others. You have to work with them behind their borders and let them work with you inside your borders. That whole conception then of getting beyond the view that we're a superpower because we have military power, we have hegemony, as one writer, Charles Krauthammer, has put it, we have the power, we should just use it, not worry about it. That totally undercuts and undermines our soft power, our ability to appeal to others, to work with others. And many of these issues, terrorism is one which I named in my book, which Graham has been working on, but global climate change is another, cannot be solved by one country alone. And we have to change our framework of thinking to see that unilateralist approaches, as though we can solve these problems alone, simply through military might, are not going to be sufficient. I wish the book had come out a little sooner. But Graham, you've also...
No, I think, Joe, just what you said is precisely correct. I think the other part, though, I go back to the point I made earlier, particularly in the aftermath of the Cold War, everything is, in a sense, up for grabs in a way that the old textbooks don't quite work. And we're all in the midst of some level of confusion in trying to sort things out. In that context, on the one hand, the U.S. is overwhelmingly preponderant in almost every measure of power. The consequence of that is that Barbara Ward used to have a phrase saying that sharing a bathtub with an elephant is an uncomfortable experience, even if it's a friendly elephant. So quite a lot of other parties find that uncomfortable. And if the elephant then reaches out to bomb you from time to time and gives you lectures when it's not bombing you about how you should run your affairs internally here and there, lo and behold, resentments arise. If we lived on a different planet, this would be an interesting story. But we don't live on a different planet. We live on the same planet. So in that context, I think there's going to have to be both a new seriousness about defending ourselves in a globalized setting in which things move across borders very easily. But there's also going to have to be some re-examination of the extent to which we feel perfectly comfortable bombing a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan or folks in Bosnia if we don't like what they're doing.
Yes, yes, right.
My name is Victoria Martins. I'm a graduate from the Ed School. It is a master's in international education and policy. My question is, are these very unique moments to start changing the discourse used when dealing with crises and bombing and attacking? Most of the news spoke about retaliation, hunting down who did it, make sure that we strike back, that everybody pays. And I wonder if these are moments, because what happened today is a consequence of what's been happening for many, many years in many other countries. Certainly is unprecedented here in the United States, but it's not in many other countries. So if this is a consequence and we continue in the same path and speaking about retaliation and paying the price, isn't this a moment to start changing that vocabulary, that way of speaking, and trying to create different kinds of dialogues?
Well, David, you have been both an expert on the press and a close observer of the American political dialogue. What do you think will happen in our dialogue? I mean, the first reaction is get even. What else?
Well, I worry about where we're heading in the next few days, in the next weeks. This could get quite ugly. And that's why it's so important that the President of the United States just, this is the time when a president frames the discussion more so than almost any other time. And why I think it's so important to have Colin Powell as part of this dialogue, because that, if he frames it well, he's been out in these two soundbite kind of occasions so far, and I don't